The roar inside Madison Square Garden that night was something primal, something that reminded you why boxing, at its absolute peak, is unlike any other sport on the planet. Two of the finest lightweights of their generation stood across from each other under the bright lights of the most famous arena in the world, and what unfolded over the next 12 rounds was nothing short of a masterclass in the art of war, with a twist that nobody, not the commentators, not the fans, not even the great Vasyl Lomachenko himself could have fully predicted going in. On one side stood Vasyl Lomachenko, the Ukrainian wizard, the man they call high-tech, a southpaw whose footwork and angles had reduced grown men, world champions, into stumbling, swinging shadows of themselves. A fighter so technically refined that sports scientists and boxing scholars openly struggled to explain him in conventional terms. He had won a world title in just his third professional fight, a feat so absurd it barely registers as real. His amateur pedigree was the stuff of legend. 396 wins, just one loss, back-to-back Olympic gold medals, and a style so deeply rooted in movement and geometry that commentators frequently ran out of vocabulary trying to describe it. On the other side stood Jorge Linares, the reigning WBA lightweight champion, a Venezuelan warrior with 44 wins and 27 knockouts, a man who had reinvented himself after nearly quitting the sport entirely. Smooth, long, powerful, and battle-tested, Linares wasn't just a name on a marquee. He was the man who owned the belt and had every physical tool to make Lomachenko's magical evening turn into a nightmare. The narrative leading into the fight centered on a fascinating question. What happens when the most technically gifted fighter alive runs into someone who is simply bigger, stronger, and longer? Lomachenko was the naturally smaller man, a featherweight by nature, climbing to 135 pounds in pursuit of history. If he could pull this off, he would become the fastest fighter in history to win world titles across 3 weight classes, doing it in 12 fights, what Oscar de la Hoya, one of the all-time greats, needed 202 professional bouts to achieve. The stakes, in other words, were staggering. From the opening bell, the choreography of the first round told you everything about the philosophical battle to come. Lomachenko immediately went to work establishing what he always tries to establish, his front foot outside his opponent's lead foot. For a southpaw, this positioning is everything. It opens up the straight left hand like a key fitting into a lock, and Lomachenko's entire offensive system depends on controlling that spatial relationship. Linares, to his credit, knew exactly what was happening and tried to use his jab and his natural size to keep the smaller man honest. Both fighters, as one ringside analyst noted, moved through those early rounds with a studied patience, each man trying to read the other's timing before committing to anything significant. Linares, the bigger man with the reach advantage, was trying to dictate range. Lomachenko, the architect, was quietly drawing the blueprint for what was to come. By the second round, those who knew boxing well were watching the feet as much as the fists. Lomachenko's footwork was already beginning to create problems. He was getting his head off the center line, slipping out of the firing lane, making Linares reach and adjust and reach again. Linares, to his credit, knew exactly what was happening and tried to use his jab and his natural size to keep the smaller man honest. Both fighters, as one ringside analyst noted, moved through those early rounds with a studied patience, each man trying to read the other's timing before committing to anything significant. Linares, the bigger man with the reach advantage, was trying to dictate range. Lomachenko, the architect, was quietly drawing the blueprint for what was to come. The story of Lomachenko, for those hearing it in full for the first time, carries almost mythological weight. He started learning boxing at the age of 4, absorbing the basics of stance and movement before most children have mastered riding a bicycle. Then his father, Anatoly, a man who's been by his son at every significant moment of his career, pulled him out of boxing entirely and enrolled him in traditional Ukrainian dance classes. The young Vasyl wouldn't return to the sweet science until he was 13 years old. It sounds like the sort of origin story invented for a comic book character. But those dance years, those hours of movement, rhythm, and spatial awareness forged into muscle memory would pay dividends that no conventional boxing education could have produced. When Vasyl Lomachenko talks about feeling the music of a fight, about sensing his opponent's beat and rhythm, he isn't speaking in metaphor. He is describing a genuinely different relationship with physical space and time than almost any other fighter alive. As the middle rounds began to unfold, Lomachenko started imposing that music on Linares. The angles were becoming more elaborate, the combinations more layered. Body shot to set up the guard, uppercut to split it, left hand to the head as the final note of the phrase. He was working the cut territory around Linares' eyes with the precision of a surgeon, probing with that southpaw jab and following with the straight left that is the centerpiece of everything he does. Linares, for his part, deployed his uppercut, described as a genuine secret weapon in his arsenal, with skill and timing, catching Lomachenko in the mid-range pocket where the smaller man sometimes chose to linger. The champion was not going quietly. He was using his size, his experience, and his champion resolve to stay in the fight and make every round competitive. Round 6 became the pivot point of the entire evening, the moment that cracked the clean narrative of Lomachenko's inevitable coronation wide open. For much of the fight, the Ukrainian had operated with the confidence of a man who had studied this puzzle and found the solution before he ever climbed through the ropes. But confidence, taken a degree too far in boxing, becomes something else entirely. It becomes exposure, walking forward with an overconfidence that was visible even in real time. Lomachenko came straight down the middle, directly into what the commentators call the firing lane, and Jorge Linares, timing him with the cold precision of a man who had been waiting for exactly this moment, placed a straight right hand directly on the button of Vasyl Lomachenko's chin. Vasyl Lomachenko, the pound-for-pound best fighter in the world according to ESPN, the man with 396 amateur wins, the two-time Olympic champion, went down to the canvas as a professional for the very first time. The reaction at Madison Square Garden was seismic. Oscar De La Hoya, sitting ringside as Linares' promoter, was on his feet. The Venezuelan corner erupted. For a few electric seconds, the comfortable story of the evening had been completely torn apart, and in its place stood something far more interesting, a real fight. Linares came out in the 7th with renewed energy, the knockdown having injected him with the kind of momentum that boxing rarely manufactures so cleanly. And Lomachenko, for the first time in his professional career, had to dig into a part of himself he had never publicly needed before. He adjusted, pulling his hands higher, re-establishing his jab, going back to first principles. The greatness of a fighter is never fully revealed in the rounds where everything is going to plan. It is revealed in the moment when the plan has been blown apart. Round 8 became a study of resilience and recalibration. Lomachenko moved with a touch more caution, probed more deliberately, and began to rebuild the architecture of his offense from the ground up. Linares, understanding the gravity of the moment, tried to press the advantage, landing another right hand that illustrated perfectly why staying on the outside, keeping Lomachenko at the end of his jab and his right hand, represented his best path to winning the fight. The crowd was loud, the fight was balanced, and the drama was almost unbearable in the best possible way. Then came round 8, and with it a turning point of a different kind. In the clinches and exchanges of that round, a cut opened over the left eye of Jorge Linares, the 9th time in his career that he had been cut in a professional fight. It was a significant wound, and for Lomachenko, it was as though a switch had been thrown. He became, as one commentator put it, a completely re-energized fighter the moment he saw the blood. Where before he had been the composed technician, now he added the relentless pressure of a man who smells the opportunity for a finish. He began placing his jab in his left hand directly on that cut with deliberate surgical purpose, not wildly, not frantically, but